Hello, welcome everyone. We're glad to have you here on this snowy day, although some of you may be coming from sunny places. I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm a faculty member in the program in the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine, and I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. I'm also a 60-ish woman with glasses and gray hair, and I'm wearing beads that will no doubt flop against the table and make noise during the presentation today. So I want to begin by acknowledging that wherever you're joining us from today, we're all located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The University of Minnesota's Twin Cities campus resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The Institute for Advanced Study acknowledges that this place has a complex and layered history, and a land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and with each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. So thank you again for joining us. We have several funding opportunities available right now. The IAS is coordinating the internal review and selection process for the Mellon Foundation John E. Sawyer Seminar, which convenes intensive interdisciplinary study, mainly but not exclusively, in the arts, humanities, and interpretive social sciences. Proposals for the internal part of the selection process are due by noon next week, Tuesday, March 1st. Also, the MnDrive Human in the Data Summer Graduate Fellowships will fund scholarship and engagement work related to humanistic questions around big data, primarily for students in the humanities, arts, and interpretive social sciences. 8 fellows will be selected and offered $7,000 summer stipends. Applications for the MnDrive Human in the Data Fellowships are due by noon, Monday, March 7th, which, yes, we know that's actually during spring break. Next week's IAS Thursday is presented in partnership with the Department of History as the annual Lauritsen Lecture, and will feature Dr. Susanna Elm talking about manliness and imperial representation. This event is a hybrid event. It will be online, but also in person in the Best Buy Theater in Northrop, if you can join us there. For those attending in person, a reception will follow the event. If you want to hear more about these opportunities and events, please sign up for the IAS newsletter. Check the chat for a link to sign up. As we have all become way too familiar, we have a few technical instructions for the audience members today for Zoom. We've enabled the Zoom auto captions, and for you to enable your ability to see those, click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom menu bar if you're on a desktop computer, or the top right menu if you're on a mobile device. And then you want to select show subtitles or view full transcript. We will have time for audience questions at the end of the event. If you have questions for our speaker at any time during today's presentation, you can enter them through Zoom's Q&A feature, which is the little double balloons also located on the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. To introduce yourselves, share resources, or have conversations with one another throughout the event, we recommend using the chat feature instead, also found on the Zoom menu bar. So be sure to select everyone when you send your message in chat. So again, you can't cut and paste from chat to Q&A, so please put your questions in Q&A and everything else in chat. I'm very happy that we have co-sponsors for today's event, and I just want to thank them. The co-sponsors are the Department of African American and African Studies, the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and the Department of History here at the University of Minnesota. And now, without further delay, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Troutt Powell. Dr. Troutt Powell teaches the history of the modern Middle East and the history of slavery in the Nile Valley and the Ottoman Empire. She's the author of A Different Shade of Colonialism, Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of the Sudan, and the co-editor with John Hunwick of the African Diaspora in the Mediterranean Lands of Islam. Her most recent book is Tell This in My Memory, Stories of Enslavement in Egypt, Sudan, and the Late Ottoman Empire. Professor Troutt Powell has received fellowships from the American Research Center in Egypt and the Social Science Research Council. She's been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And in 2003, she was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. Dr. Troutt Powell is now working on a book about the visual culture of slavery in the Middle East, which will explore the painting and photography about African and Circassian slavery in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So welcome, and the Zoom floor is yours, Professor Troutt Powell.
Thank you so much, Professor Gunn. I really appreciate that. And thank you all at the Institute for Advanced Study for this lovely invitation. And thanks to everyone in the audience, particularly the members of History 770 at the University of Pennsylvania's History Department, who have very generously moved our class to this lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen efficiently or effectively. Hang on one second. All right. Okay, Jennifer, can everyone see that? I think I'm in there.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, here's the beginning of it. All right, so my talk comes out of a chapter that I have recently published in the Bloomsbury Press edition of Fashioning Empire, and it is Fashioning the Middle East. And I want to rework it, and so that's why I'm bringing it to your attention. And I will begin now. Soon after the introduction of photography in the second quarter of the 19th century, the eyes of photographers in Europe, the United States, the Ottoman capital, and its Arab provinces were drawn to the bodies of slaves, particularly African slaves from Sudan or Ethiopia. Their ways of viewing these people were influenced by their intellectual backgrounds, their artistic training, their cultural and social upbringing. Their gaze could be deeply affected by current events in a rapidly changing Middle East and how much money was paid by patrons commissioning particular representations for very specific exhibitions, scientific inquiries, or newspapers. Whether the camera became the kind of social microscope focusing on racialized types when applied to the bodies of slaves, or whether the camera mimicked and mirrored highly stylized Orientalist paintings, those using these instruments were in constant dialogue with current discussions of race, inferiority, and colonialism, vibrantly so. Often the viewing of slaves crossed from literature to the camera and back through literary salons and the international art market, in which the Middle East was extremely important. The landscape and politics of Egypt and Sudan in particular fascinated European governments as much as the people of the region inspired topics for European art markets. So let me take a moment just to show you some very well-known photographs in the iconography of slavery in the Middle East. This is a very famous photo, although we know the year, we don't know the name, or I'm looking for the name of the subject of this photograph, who was a young man who had served in the Ottoman, or was perhaps serving in the Ottoman palaces. So he was a royal eunuch, and we can see that by the quality of his clothing. Here is another very well-known picture. This was a former royal eunuch at Yildiz Palace in 1912. So this was several years after this palace had been closed by a revolution that occurred in the Ottoman Empire. And men like this, who no longer had jobs, often used photographs as postcards or selling points to make a little money while they're, so this very well could have been a self-commissioned photograph. And then finally, we have this photograph, which was taken also, I think at Yildiz Palace in 1908, at the moment of this revolution in which a group of politicians forced out the Ottoman Sultan, and they cleaned out the royal harem. And what you see before you are pictures of Circassian concubines who would have been enslaved women or had purchased women, and then their guards or keepers who are eunuchs. And I hope that you will notice the very poignant expression, particularly on the man on the left. And you can see how deeply posed this photograph was. And I will be writing pages about this photograph for another chapter. Okay. All right. My talk today explores how a dramatic series of armed occupation and political rebellion in the Nile Valley challenged the narrational talents of the camera. In 1882, Egypt's political movement, known as the Orabi Rebellion, had been put down by British forces, who then occupied the country. This occupation would last for 70 years. In that same year, about 1,400 miles south in the city of Khartoum, Egyptian and British administrators and military figures were beginning to reckon with the rising force of the Mahdiyya, an Islamic rebellion against the Egyptian administration of Sudan. Louis Vossion was a French diplomat who was sent to Khartoum in 1882 because of his talent for photography. Much of Vossion's work is still in print today. So well regarded was he for his abilities to chronicle the politics of his times. Vossion wove his sense of racial identities and difference in his work on late 19th century Sudanese society. And let me show you a couple of examples. Here is a photograph from a volume Types du Soudan, or Sudanese Types. And this is the son of Mahmoud Bey Ahmadani. There's a little boy, probably because his father had the title of Bey, probably not a slave, but probably the product of an interracial relationship. And those who were clearly, as Vossion said, here is a picture of femme esclave, or a woman slave. And I hope you will notice how the two figures here, you see the woman, but there is also this little child holding her quite tenderly. This is also one of the pictures from these collections. So let me say a word about these collections. In 1884, two series of acclaimed photographs about the races of Sudan were published in Paris by the French photographer Louis Vossion. The constructions of racial identity framed in his Types du Soudan, that's Sudanese Types, and in the second volume, Souvenirs de Khartoum et du Soudan Égyptien, Memories of Khartoum and the Egyptian Sudan, echo themes of representations of Black bodies in then contemporary French art. And he paid very close attention to the vocabularies of race then current in Sudan. In 1881, Vossion, a member of the French consular corps, was commissioned by Prince Roland Bonaparte to travel to the part of Africa then known as the Egyptian Sudan and capture by camera the images of the residents of its capital city. Bonaparte, a nephew of the former emperor, played a huge role in the establishment of French scientific institutions, most notably the Royal Geographic Society in Paris. And this commission was one of many whose fruit, the photographs, filled exhibition halls with images of diverse people newly available or being made newly available to French art, French photography, and the budding field of anthropology. Vossion applied great energy to his job and took 108 images for the volume of Types du Soudan. This is an authoritative volume in which the most important European, Egyptian, and Sudanese officials were presented, many of whom would later be known as major architects of Sudanese colonial history. But Types du Soudan is not only a who's who of colonial officials. Most notably for my essay today, the photographer paid close attention to slaves. I'm sorry. Vossion chronicled the relationships between Sudanese women and their European or Arab husbands, registered surprise at the word marriage when interracial couples produced children, and regularly photographed enslaved people from different parts of the Sudan. The photographer left copious captions, some with the photos and then some left in his notes, that show how fascinated he was with the varying levels in which Black people participated in Khartoum society. Vossion's other volume, The Souvenirs de Khartoum, was a more informal, more personal collection of photographs. This volume usually documents his own relationships with Sudanese and European leaders and his own servants and slaves. Here, there is less reliance on the staging and settings of the pictures and more natural backgrounds like his home and the home of his friends. Sometimes there is a quiet peace in these pictures, a calm Khartoum in which the photographer is shown to be completely at ease with daily life. But brewing behind the pastoral scenes was the huge rebellion in Egypt, the Arabi Rebellion, in which Egyptian soldiers demanded Egypt for the Egyptians, and an Islamic revival and rebellion that was on its way to conquering much of the Sudan. 2 years after Vossion completed his collections, the Mahdist rebellion had besieged Khartoum. By 1885, many of the officials photographed by Vossion were either dead, imprisoned, or sold as slaves themselves to the Mahdist armies. Drawing on the two photographic collections and Vossion's notes, I would like to explore with you today why the networks of slavery figured so prominently, and how the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children were staged and configured. As certain as the photographer was about where to place Black bodies in social and cultural hierarchies, Vossion often expressed confusion when presented with or imagining racial mixing or racial passing. Damage was done to Vossion's sense of race when he tried to represent what seemed to him the strange intimacies taken with the bodies of enslaved mothers, particularly those mothers who looked like they were being treated with respect. Confusion is mixed with grief here as well. He felt keenly the power of the Mahdiyya. Khartoum would change forever. And by the time Vossion's photographs were published in 1884, the Mahdi's armies had taken over. The relationships that Vossion photographed were devastated by 1885, making it even more significant that these pictures became prominent displays in a European museum. So let me show you a picture of, let me give you a brief sense too of the kind of artistic world around which a man like Louis Vossion would have developed some sense already of the slavery in the Nile Valley and the Ottoman world. And I'm showing you here a painting by the very famous Orientalist Jean-Léon Gérôme. This is known as The Bath. It was finished in 1870. Let me also show you, and of course, Gérôme is always famous for the pictures of African descended or Black slaves and their color opposites, Circassian slaves, and always his colors and his light helped show what made him probably one of the wealthiest artists in the world in the 19th century. Here is another painting, Pool in a Harem. Of course, he would never have been allowed in a harem. This was finished in 1876. And finally, Gérôme's, one of his masterpieces, this is the Grand Bath of Bursa, one of the Ottoman Empire's largest Anatolian cities. And I just want to show you that he would never himself have been able to witness this scene, but he was able to hire Ottoman photographers so that he could capture the light that comes down in the Great Bath of Bursa. And if you see those photographs that don't have people in them, you see how faithful, almost religiously faithful to realism that was brought by the camera. All right, so here, and it's not a great print. This is, so I hope that you can kind of see among these sort of sepia tones that right in the middle, right here, this is Louis Vossion, okay? And then he has his two guards, his chawashes, and then he had two private servants here and here. Okay, one was known as Elmas, he was a eunuch from Mobutu, and Rizgallah, another eunuch from the Nuer. So he would have been probably from the south of Sudan. Louis Vossion is in the center of this photograph, taken in 1882 at his residence in Khartoum. The residence is the French consulate, where Vossion had performed the role of vice consul for 2 years. On either side of him stand two sergeants and his private servants. Both descriptions of Elmas and Rizgallah as a eunuch, and as Elmas as a eunuch and Rizgallah as being from the Nuer tribe, would imply at the time that they were enslaved or liberated members of the consulate. This is the first photograph presented in Souvenir de Khartoum, and it immediately introduces Vossion as the authority with the experiential authenticity. This is both technologically and culturally important. Vossion's 2 photographic volumes of Sudan were only the second set of books to be published in France that had photographic images actually embedded within their pages. This was a huge technical achievement that only became available in 1880. Culturally, it fortified a particular kind of faith in the veracity of the camera. And here I'm quoting the art historian Thomas Gazantre, when he writes, "This authenticity of the gaze, reinforced by the transparency registered by the camera, is also the justification of the pact made between the author, photographer, and the reader. I went there and I saw it for you." So Vossion was both author, photographer, and a political administrator for the French government, and therefore his dual authority is echoed and highlighted throughout these volumes. Vossion joined the French Consular Corps in 1877, and his first major posting was Khartoum. He arrived at a time of increasing economic and political turbulence. The Sudan was then administered by the Egyptian government. In Khartoum, this meant that Turkish-speaking Circassian army officers or Egyptian soldiers, like the leader of the Orabi rebellion, Ahmed Orabi Pasha, whose discontent with the Egyptian government was fueled partly by his service in Sudan, Coptic traders and translators, merchants from the Levant and from Europe, traders in Arabic gum, ivory, and slaves from Sudanese provinces. For years, the Egyptian ruler, the Khedive Ismail, had also hired British officials to regulate the slave trade. And in 1877, the most famous of these, General Charles Gordon, outlawed the sale of slaves from the equatorial province of Sudan in what is now much of South Sudan. The threat of income loss was keenly felt in Khartoum's business networks, and the new law was interpreted as a provocation by the Mahdi and his followers. That it was issued by a Christian British military officer did not increase its popularity. As Vossion's photos show, the anti-slave trade law was not very effective. There are slaves in over half of his pictures, but its fitful implementation threatened a vibrant commercial tradition in which northern Sudanese tribes were deeply invested, like the Danakla, the Mahdi's own tribe. Gordon and other officials of the Egyptian government became the targets of the Mahdi's pronouncements, viewed as obstructionists to the establishment of a purer, simpler Islamic state along the Nile. In Egypt, concurrent protests against corruption, financial misuse, and increased European political influence took on a more secular, but no less demonstrative tone. Ismail, the same Khedive who had hired General Gordon, had become bankrupted by the loans British and French banks gave to his treasury. In 1878, he was deposed in favor of his son Taufik, and British and French advisors took over the treasury under an office known as the Public Debt Commission. This commission demobilized, without pay, thousands of Egyptian soldiers and officers, leaving them destitute in Egypt's bigger cities and prompting Urabi's movement to reinstate their pay. This means that all of those photographed by Vossion found themselves in 1882 between two significant and growing movements, Urabi's and the Mahdiyas, that meant to restructure the political and economic infrastructure of all major locations along the Nile Valley. Through his pictures, Vossion attempted to articulate the social status quo of these intimately connected regions of the Nile Valley. And as in the introductory picture of Souvenir de Khartoum, which is in front of you, the ladders of hierarchy are carefully resurrected in his work. Louis Vossion was a government official fully vested in photographing racial and social hierarchies in Khartoum society. His pictures were dedicated to, and perhaps diminished by, their exploration of types instead of lives. Nor was Vossion a terribly imaginative artist. There is no investment in the aesthetic of the slaves' bodies in his photographs, none of the pathos that we see in abolitionist photography of Sudanese or other African slaves, nor the beauty, if you will, of Orientalist constructions of the skin color of Africans that can be found in photos taken in the photos that I showed you, or the paintings of Jean-Léon Gérôme that I have showed you. Okay. Let's see. All right. Here is another picture of Vossion's servants. These are eunuchs. These eunuchs, and you can see this is Razgalla and Almaz are still there right next to each other. These eunuchs bear a familiar dignity, but remain silent on the page. They are also tall in size, no hair on their faces, wearing foreign clothing, and on their heads tarbushes. The posture of their bodies serves as a protective gate, particularly for the vice consul photographer himself, who I hope you will notice is sitting here half in European garb, but he also has on a kind of headdress that colonial agents frequently borrowed the fashion of Sudanese or Egyptians themselves because of the weather and the heat and the sun. So any security granted to Vossion, a French citizen, would have had to have come either from the British or the Egyptian army. There would have been no French soldiers in Khartoum in 1882 unless they had been hired by the Khedive Ismail or Taufik. Rizgalla and Almaz are never shown in any other role other than that of guard. And in the more formal Titre du Soudan, they are not even named, as in the first slide I showed you of them. The reader has to use Vossion's notes to be able to compare the faces to know who the servants are. There is one picture, however, in Titre du Soudan that bears testimony to the unique relationship that Sudanese eunuchs had to local politics, wealth, and power. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's another picture. Actually, you can see this one better, of our consul right there and his guards and his eunuchs. Okay. Now here, I'm sorry that this is not such a great reproduction. But you see on the left, okay, young women of Khartoum, if they were dressed in the way they were without being covered, they probably would have been slaves. Okay, you see other comparisons of other women, but on the right is a picture of seven eunuchs. And the short caption describes them as the principal eunuchs of the harems, or the women's quarters, of Khartoum. But the longer description identifies them as a group of black eunuchs belonging to the leading Muslims of Khartoum. Leading Muslims means that they would be wealthy. So they embody the power of prominent Muslims in Sudan and in Egypt that was so worrisome and illegal in the eyes of French and British colonial officials. they showed that these eunuchs, their very presence, they were very expensive to buy, meant that there were leading Muslims who, even after all of the edicts against the slave trade, were being bought, leading Muslims were buying and selling slaves. So these eunuchs showed in this picture, played a different, much more intimate role in the lives of Khartoum than those guarding Vossion himself. So there's a menace behind the representation of these men who have been castrated, which made the price of their bodies go straight up, because it meant that there were people rich enough to be able to buy them who were right there in Khartoum where Vossion was. This menacing power is also embodied in the photograph of Sheikh Suleiman, whose portrait is the first that Vossion actually racially characterizes. And here is Sheikh Suleiman. The caption reads, Sheikh Suleiman, pure Sudanese race, or in French, pure race du Sudan, provost of the Khartoum merchants. The note to race is important. Although Sheikh Suleiman, Vossion introduces his readers to the construction of religion and race in Sudan. When the Sheikh appeared in print in Souvenir de Khartoum, the merchant is in the same pose. I think actually that Vossion used the same picture. Heavy, opulent, and jauntily holding a cigar, but the caption is quite different. Here, Vossion represents him as a classic Khartoum Muslim. The caption then reads, Provost of the Merchants of Khartoum, dealer in ostrich feathers and more or less in slaves, has afterwards joined the Mahdi, a pure scoundrel. Now, this could reflect Vossion's investment in the ostensible Anglo-Egyptian mission of General Charles Gordon, which had set to extirpate the slave trade from Sudan. It could also be an angry memorial to the majority of his photographic subjects who were either imprisoned or killed by the Mahdi's armies. But never in either volume is slavery repudiated. The photographer's mission is completely buffeted by the slaves around him, who perhaps he bought from Sheikh Suleiman. Also represented in both volumes is the Syrian trader Fathallah Jahami, and here he is right here. He was notable to Zaidan. He was notable for Louis Vossion in being an intimate of Charles Gordon's until the last minute. But in Vossion's pictures, he is more notable for his family. Fathallah Jahami married an Abyssinian woman, here she is, with whom he had several children. In several photographs, he is proudly surrounded by them, even holding his mixed race children who are dressed just like him, tenderly. And you can see this pose is actually a very sort of respectful picture of a wedding or a marriage. And here he is holding some of his kids, and they look just like him. Now, an important group of Vossion's subjects were notable for their own abilities to shift between racial identities, or certainly able to confuse the photographer himself. I'm just going to say, I'm going to use the words that he used. And so please forgive me, these are offensive words. I know we tend not to try to say them. I am going to say them though, because I think their power here, perhaps their fragile power, is worth noting. So in some instances, French words like nègre, négresse, noir, black, Arab, Arab, and his translations of them into nigger, black, Arab, cannot do justice, as if these words should ever be expected to do justice to the situation he observed. In both Type du Soudan and Souvenir de Khartoum, no one is Sudanese. For Vossion, black, nègre, nigger, and sometimes Arab are used without respect for the slaves he has posed. They tend to be naked or half naked, unless they are eunuchs or married. So the nudity of servants, slaves, dancers, and these women are sometimes described as Arabs, is a signifier of lives lived on the very bottom of Khartoum's social hierarchies. For those who visually look to be people of color but who are not enslaved and hold positions of power, Vossion places them more in terms of geographical or ethnic origin. Merchants and soldiers, consuls and doctors are Egyptiens, Syriens, pure race du Sudan, pure Sudanese race, and or de race turque of the Turkish race, or de race negroide of the Negroid race. Europeans are more carefully located on maps. They are Anglais, English, Grec, Greek, and Allemand, or German. No European women were depicted in these photographs. All of the wives shown are married to Egyptians and Syrians and are themselves identified as Abyssinian, which would have meant Abyssinian or Ethiopian, or Darfurian from Darfur. Even of the widow of the deceased Sultan of Darfur is posed. So let's look into this. We see, he shows us, Vossion shows us Faragalla Ajuri, okay, let me, hold on, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong slide. Okay, this is Faragalla Ajuri, a mustachioed official with a tall and elegant, all right, this is where the talk is going to bounce a little bit. So I'm just going to show you some of these and then let me focus on this picture. Okay, and please do look as hard as you can at this picture. This is a picture of Habib Khoury, of which Vossion noted Syrian and his family. In the center, the negress wet nurse. To the left, a Dinka servant, meaning she would have come from a tribe in the south of Sudan. To the right, an Abyssinian servant. All right, the wet nurse here, and I hope you can see this, holds the eye of the photographer and of course to the viewer of the photograph. She is bare-breasted, and on either side of her is one of Khoury's children. Khoury himself has his arm around her. This and her direct gaze at the camera are the clues to her centrality in the household. She actually seems to be the household as they sit and stand posed before one of Vossion's white tents. And let me tell you that Vossion, these volumes were widely published and sent around. And in his notes, he continued to write notes. And in his notes from 1883, he described the situation of this photograph. The wet nurse is in the center. She's actually holding her own baby and fixing her eyes to the camera, while Khoury's children, who are surrounding her, so here's one children, and then there's a blurred child over here. These are Khoury's children, and their mother had died 3 months before. So there is also grief in this picture, but I just have to say I've never, ever seen such power in any picture of someone. A wet nurse would have been a slave woman. I just think it's probably the most amazing photograph in this collection. And here is another picture of another family. Okay. Finally, okay. And then there's also, in this picture right here, and this was how this is how these photographs are printed. You see different people from different groups. Here you see little girls who were born of a marriage between a Syrian Catholic and an Abyssinian. And then to the right is the Syrian Catholic and his little girls. And the racial ambiguity of the little girls is very important. These are the types, these little girls, for instance, that defy, just by their presence in the photographs, the pure races that Vossion was hoping to find. One senses from Vossion a great curiosity about the society of Khartoum, and yet a deep and judgmental commitment to hierarchical racial orders that conflicted what he hoped to chronicle from the lens of his camera. He came from a society in which social mobility depended on the public adherence to this structure. In 1900, when he was the French consul in Sydney, Australia, he questioned the name of a consul general he assumed was illegitimate in a public and derisory manner. He really invested in titles and station and hierarchies. The captions that Vossion wrote for his photographs of the miscegenation bear an air of the same derision and mockery of the African women's elevated positions. He made this even clearer when looking back at his volume several years later in his notes. He describes certain African servants as the concubines, explaining that for Syrian men, and I'm quoting Vossion, polygamy was widely practiced, not officially, but very much present. He went on that the pictures of men like this, men like this, men like this, the picture of these men and their families gives an idea of the incredible mixing of races that operates in Khartoum and that makes it so difficult to conduct ethnographic research. His words. Vossion's derision of many of the Syrian, Egyptian, and Sudanese men in the photographs, whether they were Muslim or Coptic, suggests his own racial condescension to men he considers to be not quite white. And this attitude adds to the sense of hierarchies over which the photographer and his European subjects sit on top. And how would non-European audiences view these pictures? The wives of these men, even posing for Vossion's camera, is a blurring of hierarchies. Muslim wives, if they were Syrian, Egyptian, and Sudanese, if they were Ottoman, would never have been allowed to be posed or exhibited in such a public, open way. And when I say would never be allowed, they would not allow themselves. As Mary Roberts has shown in her fantastic work on harem paintings, official wives, elite wives, women like these who fit more into Vossion's definition of wife and not concubine would themselves have protested. And I quote from Mary Roberts, "Respectable Muslim women would not pose for European male painters. European women were commissioned to undertake their portraits. A major priority for the harem women was that these portraits were not to be seen by men. This requirement necessitated that the paintings were entirely executed within the harem, including the varnishing and framing, and that they be covered at all times." So the visibility of the slaves and concubines here is paradoxically a cloak of invisibility to the against the grain of cultural norms of public behavior and exhibition. So let me go to the photographic conclusion of these Black bodies. In Vossion's society of Khartoum, many of the protagonists we see in the photographs are dead by the time his pictures were exhibited. The photographer, though, continued to keep close eyes on Sudan, noting that the eunuch Vizgullah was sold to a Jesse Pasha, who was a European hired by the Egyptian ruler, and that Elmaz, the other eunuch, was sold to Yusuf Pasha, who was an Egyptian governor of the Shaka region of Sudan. Vossion also sent his notes to King Leopold of Belgium, a monarch deeply interested in the racial hierarchies of the other territories in Central Africa. Vossion shared no record of what happened to the Abyssinian wives and the mixed children of the officials shown in his photographs. They live on, unclaimed, in his pictures. But even though they miss a photographic gravesite, the Black people in his photographs found ways in which to make their own lights shine. They used ornaments or hairstyles or touched each other, details in which their humanity defies being bloated images of the Negro, as so loathed by Ralph Ellison. Here, particularly in this photo, we can see a woman who has owned so much of the pose that even Vossion himself has to honor her. Her caption reads in French, Fadle el-Hanez, négresse de Sénart, 28 ans, femme d'un juge de tribunal. In other words, her name was Fadle el-Hanez. She was a negress of the Sénart, part of Khartoum. She was 28 years old. She was the wife of a tribunal judge. In his notes, however, Vossion describes her more carefully, a beauty of the country, wife of a tribunal judge. Her hairstyle shows the universal style adopted by the women of Khartoum province, ribbons and fine braids framing the face. With his hint at her stylishness, the viewer can see this beautiful self-fashioning in many of the wives posing with their husbands, in the dresses with which they present themselves, and the quiet stillness of their poise. We can see among these women a will to be seen and seen correctly. Hopefully this essay serves as a remembrance of their selfhood and their lives, untypified by racial categorizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that talk. And I just want to remind people that they can enter questions in the Q&A. And I will take moderator's prerogative and ask a little bit more about how Vossion, sitting in the French consulate, in a sense, after these attempts by the British to do away with the slave trade, and I'll ask, did that include existing slavery or just additional slave trade? But what was sort of the French governmental response to essentially nurturing this under their own roof, so to speak?
That's a great question. So yes, in answer to your first question, it was the slave trade, not slavery. And of course, the employer of many of the Europeans was the Khedive Ismail, who after the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, was the largest slave owner in this part of the Middle East. I'm not looking at the Indian Ocean right now, but he had huge amounts of slaves from Sudan. And so abolitionists, European abolitionists, felt they couldn't touch that. They couldn't touch these elite, so that's not what they've been hired to do. And there was such a, I wouldn't say hypocrisy. I mean, I just think the Ottomans and the Egyptians just didn't see the point. And so the abolition, trying to hire Europeans to formulate abolition meant that let them do that. That keeps them distracted from taking over Egypt. Egypt had just been occupied. They were very nervous that they were next on the list. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
Can you talk a little bit more about where you found all of these photographs and how you started piecing them together? And is there other photographic evidence that you are seeing these in conversation with?
Yes. So I found these through the help of a Sudanese research assistant for the Department of Africana Studies years ago. And she had heard about these photographs, she hadn't found them. And so thankfully, the French government and the French Ministry of Education moved very quickly to digitize a lot of their material. I mean, faster than I think a lot of American libraries. And all of these are on Gallica, and FR. So the whole Bibliothèque Nationale de France, everything is, so I just looked them up. And there are the volumes, and it's interesting because okay. And now to the second question of what they speak to, the depiction of enslavement is very complicated in France, and it really begins with depictions of slaves from Saint-Domingue before it becomes Haiti. Then, of course, the Haitian Revolution. Those are paintings, and some of the some of those who taught Jean-Léon Gérôme, the painter, for instance, were very, very much into these kind of representations. But but what happens after the French invade Egypt is all kinds of blackness gets lumped into one, because they have Haitian soldiers, they have Haitian generals fighting in the invasion of Egypt in 1798, and there are, on the side of the Mamluk Kingdom of Egypt, there are Darfurian slaves and soldiers and Sudan, and all of this goes back in the middle of the century when Jean-Léon Gérôme begins to paint, and then he comes to the Middle East. All of these racial types get mixed into each other. So I'm trying to unpack all that by really looking at who were the models. Jean-Léon Gérôme is the center of the book in many ways, because I believe that he, as beautiful as his painting is, he really builds up a trade in the images and bodies of slaves. But he hired photographers. And so I look for those photographs of the eunuchs and all that, that's going to be another chapter. It's Faisal the first king of Iraq, is always pictured after World War I with a beautifully dressed man, clearly of African descent. I don't think a eunuch, who was his slave. He's in all of the pictures. So it's these kinds of photographs that I'm trying to piece together in my still unwritten book that's taken forever. So,
well, COVID is
I can't even use that.
Yeah. So someone from the audience is saying, have you done the same kind of study of depictions of American slaves, African slaves in the U.S.?
I have particularly those very controversial photographs that came, the ones that were commissioned by the racist Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz, that he commissioned in, I think it was 1853, in which he commissioned a photographer to take pictures, I think it's South Carolina, of slaves who had come from Africa and their children. And this was also a kind of, and these poor people, Renty and Delia are the most famous, a father and his daughter, who are photographed in the same kinds of nudity, humiliating nudity, and sort of how those speak, because I think those, as they were daguerreotypes at the time, traveled quite widely. And photography was very, very popular in the Ottoman Empire, it's very popular in Egypt. And I really believe there was a circulation in these kind of not just for scientific reasons, but also for financial reasons.
Yeah. In another question, in the book, do you discuss the relationship of these photographs to the postcards produced at the end of the 19th century, which recirculate the same racial and ethnic categories that Vossion uses? It seems he is tapping into not only established categories, but also established visual forms that have many different manifestations in visual culture, both luxurious and banal.
That's such a great point. I haven't yet, because the book's not finished it yet. And I really appreciate that point. That's a great point. And I will do that. There is a lot of wonderful work about these pictures, about those postcards. I'm really interested, though, not so much in the postcards that were created in certain salons and were sent all over the place, commissioned by, the owning class. I'm really interested in the era between 1908 to the establishment of the Turkish Republic. So the transition of the late Ottoman Empire after World War I into the Turkish Republic by former slaves, whether they were Circassian or of Sudanese descent, themselves having their pictures commissioned and put into newspapers in hopes that they would either find their families, that someone would claim them, or they can make a little money from it,
Mhm.
self-advertise, perhaps as for the men, the eunuchs, they often advertise themselves as, you need a guide to Topkapi Palace or Yıldız Palace in Istanbul. I know it intimately. I was in there, So that's the kind of dialogue I'm really interested in having.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Okay, thank you for this wonderful presentation and a well-needed one in these trying times. Could you perhaps talk about accessibilities to the colonial archives and how hard or easy it was to access? I mean, you just talked about the digitization of this, but would you describe this collection as colonial or merely a state or a personal collection? How would you categorize it?
I would categorize it as colonial, and here's why. Vossion was good with the camera, and when I mean a camera, I'm not talking about this. Yeah. We're talking about big old things that he would have to say. They would take could take an hour to even take the picture. So he was sent by Bonaparte. He was Roland Bonaparte. Everywhere he went, he would send back pictures to the Royal Geographic Society, but everywhere he went, to Burma after Sudan, and then to Australia, and then to Hawaii, he was sent, these were photographic missions to see what the natives were like, to see whether it was a possibility for French colonization. So it's overtly a colonial project.
Yeah, that is fascinating. So thank you again for this incredibly rich presentation. I'm struck by the photograph of the Syrian Habib Khoury with the enslaved Sudanese wet nurse. Khoury, I recognize, was Christian, yet in the context of Islam and Islamic cultures, breast milk, hence wet nursing, confers kinship on even children who are not biologically related. Did that fact too confound the lines of race relations, if not necessarily the racial hierarchies in Khartoum in this period?
Yes, I'm sure it did. And the reason I can say that with some certainty is because in Tell This in My Memory, I do have a chapter that looks at sort of what it was like to be a child, not a child slave, but a child of owners of slaves, to grow up with slaves. And I look at Hoda Sha'rawi, the famous Egyptian organizer of women and nationalist, and her counterpart in the Ottoman Empire, Halide Adib Adivar. And Halide herself, her wet nurse, was Sudanese, and people would constantly accuse her because she had very frizzy hair, and they would say to her, you must be Black. And she would oh my God, I must be Black. And she was teased a lot by some of the Sudanese slaves or servants in her elite father's household because of this, that you have gained, because not only did wet milk, breast milk, give you a sense, could be a mixture of racializing in these minds, but also you imbued the characteristics of the mother who's on whom you were suckling, and so absolutely, that's a really great question.
So I want to ask a question about going back to sort of the ethnographic intent of Vossion and his interest in, quote, pure races, and how this is playing out in terms of the French colonial agenda in the Eastern and Middle Eastern and part of Africa. And also about, because I was struck by something you said about, the sort of color opposites of the African slaves and the Caucasian slaves. And so I'm also curious about the concept of race and color in the Ottoman Empire as well.
That's a book worth of an answer. That's a book worth of a question and a book worth of an answer. My former student, Jada Karamorsel, and my current student, Ezgi Jakmak, both of them are Turkish. Ezgi is she's an Afro-Turk, as she calls herself, have spent a lot of time in the Ottoman archives, and they're better able to address this than I am because they are native speakers of Turkish, but they are also fluent in Ottoman Turkish. So they have both schooled me in sort of how this worked. And in the Ottoman Empire, you know, which had a slavery that was filled with white presenting people coming from the Caucasus, you know, coming from the Balkans at one point, and then African slaves. And then, of course, they had provinces in, you know, Arab provinces, and Arabs were also on a middle ground, not quite where, you know, native Turkish speakers would be. So you have a racial hierarchy in the Ottoman Empire, and you have a racial hierarchy in a different language, in Arabic, in Egypt at this time. And out of the terminologies for who was enslavable in Sudan, you have vocabularies of race that I am convinced were not articulated necessarily by the elites of society, were articulated by the jalaba, or those who were the slave raiders themselves. They needed a map in order to know where you could go, where you couldn't, because you weren't supposed to enslave Muslims, right? Or Christians for that. And you weren't supposed to enslave people of the book, but you could enslave people of non-monotheistic regions. So that's what I think, that much of what we now look at as beginning in anthropology actually began, you know, even earlier, so that people like Vossion inherited a lot of these perspectives.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Okay. Your upcoming book dealing with the visuality of the 18th and 19th century of Sudan or Egypt. Could you talk about the premise of that book? As a grad student researching colonial visual archive, I'm intrigued by it.
I hope you'll appreciate my answer. This comes out of a chapter that Kate Wall, the editor, the Middle East editor at Stanford University Press, and published my last book. And I wanted to do a whole chapter on the visual imagery. And she was like, that's not in this, that doesn't fit in this book. This is a book about narratives. That doesn't fit into this book. So I was like, okay, because I really wanted to, you know, finish that book. So it comes from Kate Wall, that, you know, she said that needs to be its own book. And that's how it's come about. And it's getting easier and easier through research to find these photographs. I think there was an earlier question about access to archives. I want to say that, you know, because of COVID, there's been, you know, it's been awful. And particularly for my students who go to the Middle East, it's been really, really difficult to get the visas, to get in. It's not so difficult to get into the Ottoman archives. It's very difficult to get into the Egyptian archives. So a lot of this is found, you know, online, and waiting for time, you know, where I have no administrative teaching. It's not the teaching, it's the administration that gets in the way, that I will be going back to Cairo, because there are just places, markets for photographs, you know, that I really want to explore. And I think this is something I could get into the Egyptian archive with.
That's great. So I just want to remind people you can enter questions in the Q&A. But so let me ask you about, I mean, you just essentially talked about markets for photographs, and so I have a colleague who, you know, was an early adopter to eBay, and many exciting resources for history of medicine have come from eBay. But
that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. Well,
Yeah.
and it really is thinking about, visual narratives and the story that you can tell from the visual. But if you have Voission's notes along with his albums, or you have the material that he sent with notes to the Royal Geographic Society, how do you contextualize and how do you think about approaching that question of the photographs you get in the markets? Or
They're much more challenging. Those
Yeah.
are much more challenging. And so what I'm hoping to look for are photographs that can be found linked to particular photographic salons in, say, Istanbul or Cairo from Ottoman photographers, because those are very well documented.
Mhm.
But I will say Vossion is a gift to a historian, because he had captions, and then he would follow up. He would write letters of notes. I mean, he sent them to that butcher, King Leopold, Belgium. We
Yeah.
have all of these. I mean, that is now there. That is just. I mean, I screamed when I went actually to the archive of the Royal Geographic Society, and I found this whole notebook. I screamed, which was not what you do there, but the archivist was so delighted, because he was like, "This never happens. This never happens." So he was very patient with my screaming. There was also an excellent archive that has a lot of pictures in it in Durham, at the University of Durham in the UK. And there's a Sudan archive there that was created by people who would have been Vossion's equivalents, the British equivalents, who brought back all of their archives and created this amazing archive. And they also have photographs. And also sometimes, if you're lucky, you find a caption. So working with photographs is very difficult, and in that way. But when you do find them, the notes to go with the images, it's great.
That's fascinating. I didn't think about the issue of a salon as a way to sort of categorize and provide a context. So that's fabulous. Okay, you mentioned that many of the subjects photographed by Vossion were tragically killed by the Mahdi's armies or sold as slaves themselves to the Mahdist forces in the Sudan. The Mahdists were, of course, engaged in a two-pronged Sudanese anti-colonial resistance against the British and against the Ottomans and the Egyptians. How did the Mahdists define the grounds of re-enslavement? You just suggested that those grounds often were defined by slave raiders. I noticed too that Vossion defines the enslaved in his photographs in racially mobile terms, sometimes nègres, you mentioned, and sometimes arabes. Whom did the Mahdists see as re-enslavable? Why? And how did slavery vex the ethical terms of their resistance?
There are reams and reams of letters that the Mahdi exchanged with his followers, and that the Mahdi exchanged with General Charles Gordon. And so, it's easy to go back to the Mahdi himself to see how he do it. But since we don't have time for that right now, I would say the other legally valid way of enslaving was through prisoners of war. And so, and the Mahdi did not consider many of those who at that time were called Turco-Circassians or Egyptians. They were called Turks to the Ottoman, to the Mahdi. He called them all Turks. They weren't proper Muslims. They had brought corruption. They were trying to take away something that was quite legal according to Sharia, and or his interpretation of Sharia, and they had lost. They lost. And so, and it wasn't just them. I mean, part of what the Mahdi's army brought slaves with them. And what's interesting though, there's a wonderful book written by one of the men who was captured. His name was Ibrahim Fawzi, and he was Egyptian. And and he has this long. He was very, very close to Gordon. He was there when Gordon was killed. He was in prison, but he knew he was very valuable to the Mahdi, even though he was technically a slave. And he's one of these guys in these pictures. He has a Sudanese concubine or wife. He has a child. He still has an Egyptian wife who's trying desperately. He was imprisoned for 14 years in Sudan, and he never got a pension for it. He appealed, to the British. Once they had taken over, they saw him as a loser. So it's complicated. It's very complicated. And he objected to being called a Turk because he had been Urabi's right-hand man. He's like, I'm no Turk, I'm an Egyptian. So, so I hope that answers it. I know I went around here, back and there, but.
No, but that's great. I do feel like every question is grounds for an entire book, if not more than one. But so thank you for this fascinating presentation, from which the author of the question, and I will speak for the rest of us, also all learned a lot. I wondered if you could say a bit more about how these photographic subjects made use of contemporary consumer goods and what these photos might tell us about material culture and consumer culture in colonial Egypt. I'm interested in how different these photos look of other colonized subjects' engagement with contemporary fashions and consumer culture, but I may be missing things in the photos.
Well, no, you're not missing anything. That makes a lot of sense. I just want to say these would not be so helpful in consumer culture in Egypt. This is really Khartoum based. And Khartoum was kind of considered a frontier city, kind of out in the wild, wild South, but it's a beautiful story because you see those who were among the elites, how beautifully they're dressed, and they are not wearing the classic tobe that is that people were wearing at this time. They are wearing very careful, almost Victorian like dresses, or they're wrapped quite elaborately in a cloth that would have been very expensive. They have all kinds of beautiful ornaments in their hair and jewelry. And it's definitely something I want to continue to explore, as I deepen this chapter about what would this mean for marketplaces and who is buying what and for what reasons, for weddings, for presents, for, the birth of your child, yeah, it's a really good question. It's something I will have to follow up on when I can finish the book. Sorry for using that excuse, but it really is it's like the check's in the mail, the book's coming. So.
Well, we're getting near the end of our time. I don't want to cut off anybody's questions. If anybody wants the last word, you are more than you're welcome to it. This has been, first, I just have to say, keeping track of all of the actors in this time period, in this kind of intense, rapidly changing, political environment. Yeah. I give you huge credit just for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But it makes you realize, I guess these last 2 years have made me realize that we are also experiencing very much this kind of upheaval. Mm-hmm. And if you think about our coming out of COVID or coming through yet another, downside of COVID, and then a war now in Ukraine, and you realize that our experiences are not so unlike those of our great grandparents.
Yes, good point. Yes, and the state of Idaho just repealed their ban on private militias. So,
yeah.
Okay, well, we have one more comment. Thanks so much for this deeply informative response. I recall your wonderful discussion of Ibrahim Fawzi in your first book. In a different vein, you mentioned Jerome's religious fidelity to photographs procured via Ottoman photographs in his paintings. but the photographs, as you noted, did not contain people. And so thus Jerome makes the invisible visible in a different kind of way. Such speaks to the point you made at the end of your presentation between the logics of visibility and invisibility that govern women in particular. Elite women reject exposure, enslaved women are compelled to pose, sometimes nude, and therefore are subject to complete exposure. I was deeply struck by the fact, however, that you made the vital point that enslaved women did control the terms of their visibility, seizing the experience of being posed and bending it to their own terms, compelling an acknowledgement of their beauty. And then there's a corrective, meant Ottoman photographers, not photographs. I think I read it wrong.
Yeah, no, it made sense. So this is a comment.
Yeah, it's really, I guess maybe it's a question about where do you think that power to control and compel the recognition of their beauty comes from in these enslaved women?
Because slave women all over the world have been able to find their inner strength. That, you know, just think in any type of slavery you're thinking of, you know, how much talent would have gone wasted, you know, how much genius would, you know, people who Vogue would kill to put on the front cover today were just slave girls, you know. But that doesn't mean they didn't realize, you know, that doesn't mean that somebody didn't love them. That doesn't mean their mother didn't whisper to them, you know, when they were little before they were traded, that you are magnificent, or that they had this great, you know, intelligence and stuff like that. I mean, think of how much talent was ground down, but you realize people fought for opportunities. You know, they found ways to try to be themselves. It's why, you know, there's always going to be a discussion of Orlando Patterson's. I was just talking about this with my students in my seminar this afternoon. You know, there's always going to be talk about social death, but there's also a renegotiating yourself. You know, I hope that answers, because history tells me that you know, people can find their worth through extraordinary measures.
Yeah, and enslavement is not an end to agency. So, yeah. So we just have a couple more comments that I will read before we close, which is to say, thanks so much for this wonderful talk and project. People are looking forward to the book. And also, thank you for the information. I'm from Sudan, and I'm really looking forward to the book too. So,
thank you.
Thank you. And so I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank people from coming as far away as Portugal and certainly from Philadelphia. And it has been our great pleasure to have you here. And I hope that you will come back soon and maybe actually in person next time.
I would love to, because I did visit in person years ago. And I want to thank Shaden again for thinking of me. Shaden, enjoyed your paper today. I can't wait to be in touch with you about it. And I just really have I just always grow whenever I have an interaction with the University of Minnesota. So.
And this was really a wonderful, it was a wonderful opportunity. And I will let everyone else follow up with you personally.
Please email me.
Is filling up with thank you.
Oh, that's so kind.
So enjoy the daffodils in Philadelphia for
there is coming. It's a little cold today, but and I hope the snow. resolves itself soon.
Oh, yeah. it looks like the cars are taking it slowly out there, but
All right, be careful on your way
appreciate
home.
that. And if you want to look at the chat, you'll see some of those nice comments.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, so much. It was really a pleasure.
It really was. Thank you, Turi.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Sang.